This is ESG Decoded, the podcast powered by Global Affairs Associates to provide relevant, actionable updates related to business innovation and sustainability. Join Kaitlyn Allen and Amanda Shea of Global Affairs Associates for thoughtful, nuanced conversations with industry leaders that explore the complexities, the risks, and the opportunities connected to all things ESG. I'm Yvonne Harris, a consultant and co-host, and I will be collaborating with Kaitlyn and Amanda for the discussions that we will present on this podcast. Put simply, ESG is everything that is not on your balance sheet. This leaves room for misunderstanding, oversimplification, and the tendency towards one-size-fits-all perspectives. None of that will happen on this podcast. Enjoy this episode.
Hey everyone, welcome back to ESG Decoded. I'm your host, Kaitlyn Allen, and today I have with me Chris Parker, the director of the Plastics Credits Program at ClimeCo. I am so excited to have Chris on today. This is an absolutely one-of-a-kind, really, really interesting topic and program, and I can't wait to dive in. Chris joined ClimeCo in 2021 with 20 plus years experience in energy and commodity markets, sustainability, conservation, and ESG. He leads ClimeCo's plastic market program, which partners with projects worldwide to recover and recycle plastic waste. This program expands financing mechanisms to scale the transition to a closed-loop economy while providing companies with ESG and corporate responsibility solutions to support ecosystem restoration. Before joining ClimeCo, Chris consulted and led projects in both the corporate and environmental nonprofit sectors to create business solutions for a sustainable economy. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Kaitlyn, great to talk to you. I'm glad to do this.
Absolutely. Let's start with a fun question, as I try to always. You have really incredible experience both in financial markets and also on the environmental side. But I think where I'd like to start is your first job out of college. So what was the first thing you did right after graduation and why?
Sure. So the first job I had out of college was supposed to be a summer job, and it turned into almost 4 years. I worked as a fly fishing guide and instructor in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the Cayman Islands. And so I went out from the south where I live. Went out to Wyoming, what was supposed to be for a summer, working for a fly fishing outfit, and it turned into 4 years because I was working in fly fishing, and I got to be in Wyoming and the Caribbean back and forth. And so, yeah, that was definitely still my favorite job.
Sounds like a dream. So when you were out on the ocean all the time, it was that kind of your first interaction with ocean plastic?
Well, I grew up on the ocean, but certainly there wasn't anywhere near the plastic problem then as a kid that there is today. But I do recall one day guiding on a coral flat in a mangrove area, and a piece of green floating plastic came by, and picked it up out of the water to put it in my boat. And it was from the UAE, so it was from the other side of the world, floating along in the Caribbean, and so. This was back in the 90s, but I guess that was my first indication a long time ago of, the global plastic problem with the ocean, I guess.
So that plastic had floated all the way from the United Arab Emirates to the Caribbean.
It certainly looked like it, yeah.
Yeah, impressive. Well, let's start right there at the very beginning with some definitions, because, a lot of this is very novel. Novel finance, novel market mechanisms to try and incentivize environmental protection. So let's just start with what is a plastic credit? Can you give us the sort of 101?
Sure. So probably a good amount of your listeners are familiar with carbon offsets or carbon credits. In the most basic terms, a plastic credit is a carbon credit or a carbon offset, but for plastic. And so a plastic credit represents 1 ton of plastic that was either removed from the environment or recycled from a non-productive source. And so 1 credit really represents that ton of plastic that was collected or processed. Like other instruments like carbon credits, it's a market-based mechanism. So it's the price is driven by supply and demand, and there are something that we can get into later, but that they're really the structure of them is quite the same as carbon offsets and the verification style, and sort of act that way as a credit for plastic, but work like a carbon offset.
Okay, and so when you say independent, you mentioned independently verified. There's not many of these out there, right? I mean, ClimeCo technically brought to market the world's first plastic credit this year. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So there are today 2 public independent protocols for projects to work off from. One of them being Vera, which is one of the primary carbon offset registries. The other being, it's called the Ocean Bound Plastic Certification, and it's by an NGO called Zero Plastic Oceans. Both protocols work pretty similar, where the project has to adhere to the requirements of the protocol. Lots of documentation, both on the environmental and social aspects of the project's operations, to be able to qualify to issue credits. And when credits get issued, each ton credit gets an individual serial number, which is recorded and tracked on a public registry. And when a purchasing organization buys a credit, that credit actually gets retired on the registry, and that company can use that offsetting claim if they want, and that credit can't get sold to anyone else. That claim can't get used again, so it sort of prevents double counting. And you're right. Earlier this year in the summer, ClimeCo brought to market the world's first plastic credit that came from one of these registries, which require third-party verification auditing.
Wow, it's so interesting. I mean, it's a whole different world, the world of environmental commodities markets, because it's different than a tangible, it's not a dollar that's being traded. And I think the mechanisms behind these types of commodities to make sure that they are legitimate, to make sure that there isn't double counting, to make sure that there's traceability, all of that is, I think it's the sort of things that folks that are maybe hesitant to look at offsets as part of the solution, they need to understand that there are systems set up to make sure that those ones that do make it to market are legitimate, specifically for plastic, because it's new, right? So a lot of the difficult learnings from carbon markets, it seems like this plastic credit market is starting far ahead, right?
I would say that's right. The new plastic credit market has the benefit of looking back almost a decade and a half of what went right and what went wrong with the carbon credit development, and so the sector can sort of start off on a stronger place. Out of the gate, when ClimeCo started our program, we were only going to develop projects that were working on one of the 2 public standards that require this third-party verification for a few reasons. One, since we primarily serve larger corporate clients, it really provides the accountability, the transparency, and in a way, sort of the risk management that a large corporate is going to require before deploying capital into an instrument like this. So it's really out of the gate designed to sort of serve that market. There are other programs around the world that have sort of their own type of plastic credit, but they are working on sort of in their own program with their own type of claim, and at the end of the day, sort of self-certifying themselves. And while I think that's going to work pretty well for individuals and some small business, certainly the large corporate sector needs a level of accountability and traceability and risk management that these sort of instruments provide now.
Yeah, that makes sense. And especially, there's so much talk and interest from the investment community on this. I'm just wondering what your perspective would be as you've sat at the desk as a finance guy, right? When you think about the investor perspective on these types of environmental commodities, what do you think of?
Well, I mean, for investment funds or for investors and corporations who are using these as part of their sustainability platform, I mean, it's pretty much a can't live without sort of situation. I mean, if that they need that level of accountability that to work off of a standard that's created and overseen by a different entity, and then having the verification done by then again another entity. It's sort of like a corporation having an outside CPA firm come and do their taxes and do their accounting. It's just the business world sort of requires it. On the investment side, I will also kind of dive into a little bit that I think the same factors that have driven climate and carbon related actions in the corporate landscape are the same factors that are driving plastics, meaning that investors and customers and company employees and supply chains are really demanding that companies, well, one, take action on climate because of that critical issue, but also the issue of plastic pollution and plastic waste is so much now in the public eye that all those same stakeholders want companies to address the plastic problem one way or another, whether they're an actual plastic producer or a large plastic user like a beverage company or a consumer packaging company, but even companies like an airline, a bank, a hotel, a retailer, they all have plastic footprints to some degree, no matter what their business is. And so the public now is just expecting companies to take action and help work on the problem. And so thankfully, the plastic credit mechanism now is providing the structured, certified avenue to do that.
So now that we've talked about that as a kind of laying the groundwork there, let's talk about some specific projects. So when you say a ton of plastic, a literal physical ton has been removed from the ocean, how do you actually do that?
I'll before kind of jumping into maybe talking about a couple of specific projects to let people sort of hopefully get an idea of what they do and how they function. I'll say that in general, plastic credit projects are a little more complicated or at least have a lot more features to them than something like a project that does carbon offsetting. And mainly that aspect comes from the human factor in these projects. For every ton of plastic that either gets removed from the environment or reprocessed or recycled, there are humans working on all of that every time. And so the people who are working on the project, oftentimes in locations that are the most affected and being negatively impacted by plastic waste, are very much local stakeholders in the projects themselves and should be the long-term beneficiaries of what the projects should be accomplishing. Actually, if we have time, I'm going to talk about two different projects in two different parts of the world to kind of give people a visual of what these projects look like. So our first project, which we brought up before, is in Vietnam, and it's called Ton to Ton, and they specifically target the ocean-bound plastic removal of non-recyclable, no-value plastic. And they remove this material from rivers and shorelines and islands and coastal communities. And it's a no value plastic. For one, it's either one, too damaged from being in the environment to be able to be recycled, or it's just the wrong sort of plastic that doesn't have a real feasible recyclable application yet today. So it really has no value to anyone. And the only way that this project can afford to remove this plastic from the environment is through the financing of the plastic credit. And so the funding from the plastic credit mechanism allows the project to hire more workers, create financial incentive structure for workers to be incentivized to collect more of this no value plastic through the program. This particular project in Vietnam, it hires mostly female workers by design, giving them sort of above average pay than they would probably get otherwise, given their sort of education and skill level, providing personal protection equipment and health insurance, which would also be a little difficult for the average worker working in the project to be able to afford on their own. And so that project now is going to be expanding into Cambodia, and we're launching a pilot project first quarter of next year with the UN Development Program and the Cambodian Ministry of Environment to start in two coastal villages in Cambodia with the Ton to Ton project, areas that are very overwhelmed really with ocean plastic pollution and have nowhere to put it once it's collected. And so we're going to be building collection centers for them to be able to deposit it and then be able to process it and then longer term find a next life solution for it. Another very interesting project that we're developing in the Ivory Coast also collects ocean-bound plastic from the coastal environments in Ivory Coast. What they specifically do is, again, they're collecting mostly non-value, non-recyclable plastic, and they have a proprietary formula that they use, putting different kinds of plastics together, and they produce modular construction bricks out of it. And they make these bricks in their own facility and supply the bricks to UNICEF, which is building schools in Ivory Coast with the bricks. And so, these schools are getting built in areas that have very under capacity for schools, given the amount of need that's there. So the project is really working on two problems at once by using this removed plastic waste, making bricks out of it, and then building schools that kids in Ivory Coast very much need. They also have a program called the Way methodology, which is for women and young people, and it is all female worker participants are in it. And through the program, they get job training, worker rights advocacy in the waste management industry, and they get again health insurance and also benefits for their childhood education. And so it's really providing them a career path that otherwise they really, again, given their skill level and education, probably wouldn't be able to obtain otherwise. Yeah, so that's sort of a snapshot into two pretty interesting projects that we're working on.
So a couple of things strike me. One is that, which I think is the most obvious one, right? That this type of mechanism really directly addresses multiple sustainable development goals at the same time. So that's one of the themes overall of our podcast, right? Is that the sustainable development goals often conflict with one another, right? You have trade-offs you have to make when you're making decisions as a company, as a world, as a global community. And I think this is such an interesting project and initiative because it directly addresses two at the same time, right? With almost zero negative, externalities associated with it. So I think that's really interesting. And there's obviously, like you said, because there's this human element, someone has to physically collect the plastic. There's this really natural fit with social development and jobs and local economies and all of that kind of stuff, education, a lot of indirect benefits because of the human side of this. So I think that's really, really interesting. The other thing that strikes me is that it sounded to me when you were describing the finance mechanism that it's the plastic credit itself that creates the financial incentive to actually set up these companies and do this, right? So what I'm understanding here is that a lot of this ocean-bound plastic collection, especially of the non-recyclable, no-value plastic, wouldn't otherwise happen without the credit. Is that right? Is that fair to say, I guess?
Yes, that's absolutely right. So that first project I talked about in Vietnam, without the plastic credit mechanism and without the funding that comes through it, there's really no way for this project to function and exist. There's no economics that would support it, and so they through the funding that comes from the credit transactions, can hire workers, pay workers, buy equipment to remove plastic that no one has any incentive to remove besides just doing it on a volunteer basis. But in the areas they're working, the volumes of plastic waste are so high that an occasional beach cleanup is not going to do much. It's not going to have much impact. And so also the longer term goals out of these plastic credit projects is not just to keep removing plastic on an ongoing basis, but to use maybe the funding that comes in year 2, year 3 to build more advanced waste management facilities, to create new recycling infrastructure that doesn't exist at all in most of these locations. And so, and in doing that, can create a longer term problem for the in each location, and hopefully in the meantime, other parts of the landscape, in industry and product design and alternative material use, can solve some of the production of the plastic in the first place. So, plastic credits certainly aren't going to solve all of our plastic problems, but they're going to solve some things very well, and they're not meant to be permanent. I don't want to see a plastic credit project still doing what they're doing today 15 years from now, because that means that something hasn't gone right. There's a concept in the carbon offset world of projects having permanence, especially with forestry projects. And so companies buy forestry offsets with the intention of them having permanence, meaning that those forests should be standing 100 years from now. For a plastic credit project, by design, we don't want permanence. We want them to have a limited life. And so, because if that's the case, that means that we've been successful in transforming the sort of landscape that these problems exist in.
That's so interesting, that this distinction of permanence, that definitely something that wouldn't have occurred to me, but it makes total sense, right? Because this is tackling, like, I hate to say low-hanging fruit. We say that all the time, but it's it's the obvious things, like, yes, we need to clean up coastlines, we need to clean up the ocean. It seems very basic, and yet, of course, like you said, doesn't get to the root causes of the problem, but is a really important incentive to make it happen when it otherwise wouldn't, right? I think the other thing I was thinking about is just more broadly how interesting it is that there's so much novel finance just generally to help solve these global problems that affect everyone, but obviously most times affect countries experiencing poverty and communities experiencing poverty much more profoundly than, say, us sitting in our comfortable homes here in the US. So I think there's just a more creativity and innovation happening right now in financial markets, in environmental commodities markets, to use market-based mechanisms to incentivize things that contribute to the public good, contribute to the sustainable development goals. It's just so interesting to me.
That, and you're right to look at it that way. And I think a new innovation like the plastic credit also has these other expansive financial impacts in the communities that they're working in. A real direct example is the funding from the plastic credit, obviously, as I talked about before, is helping to remove plastic from these certain communities that are getting inundated with it. Some of these communities, are traditional fishing villages, which today there's villages that are catching more plastic than fish. So their income is being directly damaged by the plastic, and they can't make a living the way they used to because there's the plastic is literally in the way of their fishing business. And also other areas are suffering from ecotourism which used to be sort of ecotourism hotspots where visitors would want to go to see pristine coral reefs and beaches and jungles or mangrove areas, where today they're inundated with plastic pollution, and tourists is not going to want to spend money to go to a national park that's covered in plastic. And so these communities, which had pretty good businesses for a while for the ecotourism, is getting damaged too. So the benefit that comes from the funding from plastic credits in the communities like that, where initially it's giving people some jobs and some other social benefits around the work that they're doing to remove the plastic, but in places like that, it's actually going to hopefully restore longer term employment opportunities for them.
So bringing it back to the topic of ESG and thinking about, from a corporate perspective, from an investor perspective, how one might use plastic credits as part of say achieving a target. Say I have a plastic reduction target to reduce the use of plastic in my company. Obviously, I have to use some plastics. I'm a manufacturer, and that's actually one of our clients, right? They have an internal plastic reduction target. It seems like this would be a nice way to become plastic neutral, even if you can't eliminate every part of plastic that you use, because it's just so ubiquitous and is obviously necessary for a lot of manufacturing processes and parts, components, that sort of thing. But if there's a way to I guess, is offset the right word? Offset the remaining part of their footprint using a plastic credit, then you can actually help get to that plastic neutral goal. Is that a fair way to think of it?
Yeah, it's a way. It's not quite as easy or as linear, I guess, as the offsetting happens in the carbon world. With carbon offsets, you're basically counting greenhouse gas molecules from one place or another, and in the atmosphere, the math is all the same. With plastic, it does get a little more complicated because there's different types of plastic, and companies use plastic differently depending on what their business is. And so, it's going to be tough for companies to really, offset probably all of their plastic footprint depending on what they do. But it's certainly a voluntary way for a company to take action, to proactively take action to help mitigate a certain volume of plastic that's damaging, global society. A couple of specific examples that, if you're a computer company, your product only has a little bit of plastic in it. It's not, you don't have a big plastic footprint given your whole business, but you have a little bit of plastic in the machine, and there's probably some plastic used in the shipping and the packaging. For the time being, it's pretty tough to make a functioning computer without using some plastic. I mean, it's just not feasible to not use it. And so while a computer company has to do that, using a plastic credit to address a certain volume that is in their corporate footprint through the plastic credit can be done specifically, because it's done by weight. And so, the same if you're a cruise line or a hotel or a bank or an airline or every company has some sort of plastic use in their business, no matter what they do. It's just a fact of life. And so, this is again a voluntary way to take action to meet plastic goals that if a company doesn't have yet, I would say that almost every company is going to have them in the next few years, because it's seen the same way that the carbon world unfolded. The interesting thing around using plastic credits with ESG goals, in that it's usually starts as a plastics discussion or an environmental waste and pollution topic. But as we've already talked about, the social aspects around these projects are so key to the project, and they're such an important core part of it, that if done right, you can actually address social issues in the same project. Like with the project we mentioned that hire all female workers. If you have a goal to help promote the employment of women in a developing country, this is a way to measure that directly. Or provide health insurance, provide greater health access, or there's a variety of ways to do it that, again, start as a plastic problem, but address sort of an array of issues. And overall, in ClimeCo's plastic credit program, through the whole program, we're aligned with 8 different sustainable development goals across the menu of projects.
So, Chris, this sounds really, really interesting for corporations, for investors, especially if you have a geographic specific fund or you operate in a certain country where, like you said, maybe you're a cruise line and clean coastlines are important to you, right? But not necessarily that. Maybe you're a manufacturing company that has facilities in Vietnam, right? There's some really interesting direct linkages there that, like you said, I think are part of a much larger story to tell. But I'm just curious, what if I wanted to offset my own plastic footprint? Can individuals buy these as well?
You can. We've recently launched a new service for individuals and families to do that, where we actually, it's called ClimeCo Green Service, where you can go on and calculate your sort of average family footprint for plastic by country, and then from that, by the kilogram, you can sort of offset your family plastic footprint, and then learn about all the aspects of what the projects are doing, and it can be taken down to the individual level by kilogram.
Wow, that's super cool. I'm going to check that out. I know I should know about it, but it's only week 6.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but that's really, really interesting. Well, thanks so much for being on. This is such a fascinating topic. As folks know on this podcast, I'm a big fan of market solutions for any global externality problem. So it's really, really interesting to dive into this with you. Thanks so much, Chris. And we'll have a long list on the resource boost for this episode because there's a lot of different players that Chris mentioned. So you can find all of that in the social media and in the podcast descriptions. Thanks so much for joining us and have a great weekend.
Appreciate you having me on, and it was great talking about this. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to ESG Decoded. Subscribe to this podcast wherever you consume yours and follow ESG Decoded and Global Affairs Associates across social media platforms. Until our next episode, take what you learned today to drive long-term value for your organization by doing good for people and for the planet.